Well, thank you, and I appreciate as well so many people coming to this event, and thank you to the Dean and Chapter for letting us have such a wonderful stage in which to have this debate. For those of you who've been here in previous years, you know we've done a question time normally at this time of year, but we thought this year, because of the polarized issue that we have in front of us, that a debate format would be a better way to tease out the issues. So in exactly 112 days from now, we will be awaiting the result. And it's a complex issue, as we know, and as we have seen, high-profile figures are populating both sides of this argument. From a business perspective, we've seen even today at the Chamber of Commerce annual conference that there are perhaps even surprising variations in the views between some business leaders. I suspect, for many of us, however, the decision is not yet that clear-cut, and we don't really have enough information to make the right choice at this stage. Hopefully tonight we'll start the journey, all of us on that journey, towards that all-important ballot box decision. So in a moment I will introduce the panel and we'll just start the debate, but if you haven't yet done so, I would remind you to use your phone to register a vote. There are more people here than we expected this evening, so we did at one point think we would do an alternative type of ballot, but with the number of people here, hopefully you are getting the ability to send a text. I know some people have struggled to send their text. I would say keep trying. The signal does vary a little in the cathedral. If you try many times, it will only register it once anyway, so keep trying if you've not had yet success. First, I would like to first of all explain how we got the panel that we have. Some of you have commented, even walking in this evening, perhaps the lack of diversity from some angles on the panel. It was certainly not intentional. We actually approached our database of 1,200 people that are registered for the Ely Cathedral Business Group events in the past. And we have accepted everyone who has put their name forward to be on the panel. In fact, at one point, we maybe thought we might have a bigger panel, but we have 6 on the panel. But the good news is that there is plenty of time during the evening for all of you to take part. And I hope that when we get to that part of the evening where you can take part, that everyone does take the ability to put your views forward or challenge the panel members. So it's with that context that I actually congratulate our panel for putting themselves forward and firmly nailing their colours to the mast. We don't see strongly enough, I think, in this day and age, people strongly articulating their beliefs. And I thank these 6 people for being prepared to do so and kick off the evening for our proceedings. So let's start by giving all of our panel a round of applause. If I could ask each panel member to either maybe stand up or raise their hand as I introduce them. So we have George Freeman, MP for Mid-Norfolk, and also the first ever government minister appointed to represent life sciences. George started his political career in 2010 after 15 years supporting high-growth businesses in the Cambridge area. We have Stuart Agnew, MEP for Eastern England and member of the European Parliament Agriculture and Rural Development Committee. He is also a livestock and arable farmer at his farm in Fakenham. We have John Shropshire. John is chairman of G's Fresh Group of Companies, one of the largest businesses in this area, with sales of over £400 million and employing over 5,000 people. We have Nick Clarke. Nick is the UKIP candidate for Police and Crime Commissioner in Cambridgeshire. He's well known to this area. Nick was leader of the Cambridgeshire County Council, as well as building a number of high-tech companies in the area. We have William Martin. William is a successful sugar beet and cereal farmer from Littleport. William is also chairman of the NFU Sugar Board, a role he's held since 2008, and he's also served in a similar role globally. And we also have John May. John is the East of England chairman for Business for Britain, an organisation supporting businesses who want to see a change in our relationship with the EU. John has also been a director of over 50 companies in his career across a wide range of sectors. So welcome again to the panel. So our format this evening will be as follows. Each of the panel members will give an opening statement. We will then have a period of debate where each of the panel will get a chance to challenge someone from the other side on something that they said in their opening statements. We then open to you as the audience, and you'll have the chance to do one of two things. You can make a comment or a statement yourself, or you can challenge or ask a question of one of the panel members. We will then ask George and Stuart, representing each of the sides of the debate, to give a final summary at the end, and then you will get a chance to vote for a second time to see whether the debate has in any way changed the views of the audience. So before we start, let's have a look at the result. So, quite decisive before we start, which is we have a big vote for in, and the outs and undecideds are very equal at this stage. So, but this is really only the beginning, and I do expect as the evening progresses that some of these views could well be changed. So, let's move into the debate itself. Time is of the essence this evening for two reasons. One, to ensure we have equality between opinions, and number two, to ensure we cover the most ground. So please respect the timings as I announce them. And I also have a most wonderful assistant in Beverly who will have a few techniques to ensure that your time is adhered to. And my advice is really not to upset her, because her influence to encourage you get rapidly punitive as the time progresses. So on with the debate. To ensure a fair approach, we will decide the start by one of the members of the audience. I've got the name of both George and Stuart in that bag, so if someone could just select who will go first. Hopefully it doesn't say a completely different name.
No.
George. So, George, you're up first, and you will have 10 minutes. You will be immediately followed by Stuart, who will have the same amount of time, and then the other panel members will have 5 minutes each in turn. I'll alternate side by side. Beverly will show you a card at 1 minute to go, and a bell when the time is up, and there's also a timer up behind me for people to refer to as we go through. So, George, over to you.
Well, Michael, thank you. Thank you to the Dean, and thank you to Tom and the Ely Cathedral Business Group for holding this tonight. And thank you all for coming out on a dark night for a debate which I think leads to a really profound and important question that will shape the future of this country and the future of the society and economy that our children and grandchildren will grow up in. And it's a pleasure to be here joining it tonight. The central point is that this is not a decision that politicians will take for you. On the 23rd of June, you will all decide. We are sovereign, and you will decide this question. And tonight I think it's crucial that you hear the full range of the debate. I want to suggest that we should make this decision on the basis of what's best for the country and for the next generation. For me, I come to this as a father of two children, as an East Anglian, as an MP for Mid-Norfolk, as a minister at the Department of Business, as a passionate advocate of a one nation, compassionate, generous, conservative, responsibility, enterprise philosophy, critical of unaccountable elites and of bureaucracies wherever they hold back civic responsibility, a subject I've spoken on in this great building before. And I think it's crucial that we don't just make the right decision on June the 23rd, but that we make it for the right reason. 40 years ago, this country voted to join what was then called the EEC, the Common Market. Since then, our country has been transformed. Our world has been transformed. In many ways, it is unrecognizable. And those of you who saw the video recently shown of the story of the 74 referendum will have cast a wry smile, not just at the fashion, but at how far this country has come in that time. In many ways, it's been a journey for the better. One only has to look at the standards of living, the quality of life, the quality of our cities and of our villages, the quality of health, and the economic prosperity, the freedoms, the liberties, the civil rights that this country has developed in the last 40 years. But it's true, we also live in a more complex, challenging, difficult, and in many ways unstable world. For all of the terrifying certainties of the Cold War, there was a certainty which today we miss. The world is volatile and unstable. Globalization is a threat, a challenge for many. The internet has unleashed extraordinary powers across the world, and a world of cheap travel and international mobility. In many ways, it would be wonderful to turn the clock back and to be part of a singular, sovereign, small country, a country that treated itself like a small community and was cut off from those extraordinary challenges. The romantic in me would love it. But after very careful consideration over the last 15 years in business, as a trade envoy for this government around the country, as a business minister, as an MP, I'm here tonight to put the case to you that I am absolutely convinced that our interests are best served by voting on June the 23rd to remain in the reformed European Union. 5 reasons. Firstly, the reforms that the Prime Minister has negotiated are real, substantial, and bound in law. They give us the best of both worlds, access to what we want out of the European Union and the single market, but not to be run by it. I want to make the case that we are better off in Europe, that we're more secure in Europe, that we are stronger in the world through the European institutions, and I want to make a moral case that we are a better society, a better democracy, a better country for taking our responsibilities to the globe seriously and our responsibilities to Europe. How are we better off inside the European Union? Well, access to that single market of 500 million consumers represents our biggest trading partner. 49% of UK trade goes to Europe. 3 million jobs generated here as a result of that trade. 61% of our small companies trade into that European market. 61% of our SMEs exports go into that European market. And that's why 80% of small businesses, it's not just the big, small businesses in this country, say that the European Union market is crucial to their future growth. But secondly, we get phenomenal benefits from cheaper imports, the invisible benefit. Because of the lack of trade barriers, of tariffs, the World Trade Organization have put a value on it for us. It's £11 billion every year. Thirdly, we get extraordinary inward investment. This country has led in Europe in the last few years. Phenomenal investment into our country. Not all, but a large chunk of that is because we are an English-speaking gateway into the European single market. In my own sector of life sciences, in the last 4 years, we have attracted over £7 billion. A big chunk of it has come to this region. And it's coming here because we are a progressive, ambitious, English-speaking, globally orientated, but a market, but an entry into the European single market for pharmaceuticals and medical devices. As members of the EU, we're also eligible for the 50 trade agreements that the European Union has negotiated around the world, and we're leading the negotiations on those trade agreements that we're putting in place at the moment with America, with Japan, and with Australia. Yes, this comes at a cost. We'll hear something about that tonight, no doubt. Fortunately, it's been measured for us. It costs quite a lot of money. It costs us £340 every household every year to belong to this club, net. But fortunately, the CBI have worked out what the sum of that membership is worth for every household in this family. It's 10 times that value. It's £3,000 every household to belong to this extraordinary market. So I want to make the case, firstly, that we're better off. And here in the Eastern region, and my colleagues will expound on this tonight, in agriculture, in science, in technology, we are underpinned not just by the CAP, but by Europe's investment in science and research. And the boom in Ely and in Cambridge is underpinned by our membership of a European network of universities, research institutes, and science funding, and that single market. Secondly, how do these reforms that the Prime Minister's negotiated really protect us and deliver what most people in this country want? Membership of Europe, but not to be governed and run by Europe. Well, on sovereignty, we have exempted this country from the endless ratchet, which I and others have criticised over the years, of ever closer union, used to conceal that ratcheting of loss of sovereignty. We've put in place a red card so that we, with other countries, can block unwanted legislation, and we've put in a new statutory mechanism to ensure and put in law the concept of subsidiarity, that which can be done by the member state and is best done by the member state is done by the member state. Secondly, on competitiveness, we've got an agreement from the European Union to complete the single market, the thing we joined this for in the first place, in digital, in legal services, and in energy. 3 huge markets for our companies. And we've got a new commitment to deregulation. Finally, the European Commission have put it in the DNA of their organisation and their mandate to create a more deregulated and competitive European market for global competitiveness and growth. On the currency, we've exempted the UK from liabilities connected with possible fallouts from the European currency. Now, that is one of the issues I have been very worried about, that the Eurozone might fail and that we may get pulled into having to bail out the Eurozone economies. We are exempt from that. We've also exempted the City of London from the risk of being over-regulated inappropriately by Frankfurt and Paris, and we've enshrined in the European agreement security for the pound. We cannot be discriminated against because of our through not being part of the European currency zone. And on immigration, a subject that for many is crucial, we're not, of course, in the Schengen agreement. We've now secured a 4-year exemption so that people who come here, economic migrants who come here, cannot claim full benefits from day one. We've ended the child benefit tourism issue so that if people come here and they have children back in Eastern Europe or poorer parts, they can't export and send back child benefit at UK rates. They can only send it back at the rate at which it would have been received were they in their country. We've closed the sham marriage loophole, which has been abused, and we've negotiated new protections against mass migration for new entrants. And I would point a finger of some blame at Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. When the Eastern European accession countries joined, it was inevitable that people liberated from the yoke of communism, able to come to the UK, would do, and we could have predicted huge numbers coming. And I think it's important that we've established and negotiated that agreement. So in the single market, but not in the Eurozone, in the European Union, but not subject to ever closer political union, benefiting from the freedom of movement of people, capital, and companies, with protections against fraud and abuse, it's a good deal. It's hard won, carefully negotiated, in Europe, not run by Europe. The phrase set out by that great Eurosceptic William Hague, who is backing this agreement. Thirdly, how are we more secure inside the European Union? We live in an unstable and a dangerous world. Cyber security threats, international crime, terrorism, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Russia rearming. Is that 1 minute? Is that time up? I'd simply say this. I'd put it to you that on June the 23rd, you have a chance to vote for something more optimistic, more ambitious, and a country prosperous, more stronger, and more secure in Europe and in the globe.
Right, good evening. Wonderful place, Ely Cathedral. I never, ever thought, A, I would be a politician, and B, I would be speaking in Ely Cathedral. Now, on the 23rd of June, we've got an opportunity to take our democracy, to get our democracy back. What is my definition of democracy? The ability to elect and dismiss those who govern you. That is my definition of democracy, and you've actually lost this over the last 40 years. How have you lost it? You've lost it because various prime ministers have signed treaties, all of which should have referendums. So we're having a debate here tonight before a referendum. That's the second referendum there's been. Actually, there should have been 6 referendums, because in each of these treaties, a big slice of your power to elect and dismiss those who govern you was taken away from you. So, Treaty of Rome, we had a referendum on that. We knew we were going to get a customs union with 6 or 7 other countries in Western Europe, and we knew there was going to be a common agricultural policy. We were deceived into being tricked into losing our fishing waters. It was in the small print. We never knew anything about that. Nevertheless, we had a referendum, and we said we would go with a customs union and a CAP. That is what we signed up for. Then Mrs. Thatcher comes along. Yes, swinging the handbag, apparently. No, she would say in Europe. Not a bit of it when it actually came to the crunch. She signed something called the Single European Act. She agreed there could be a parliament. We never heard anything about a parliament. That wasn't what we voted for. There'd be a parliament in Brussels somewhere. And what's more, she gave up her veto. The principle of her veto, she gave that up in that treaty. There should have been a referendum on that. From then on, we were subject to the views of other people in the running of this country. Yes, she regretted signing the treaty, we know that. She went to a town called Bruges in Belgium, and she said, I wish I'd never signed that treaty. I didn't know what I was doing. I was distracted by the miners' strike, the poll tax, and this and that and the other. And she made that speech. Next minute, she was out. The rest of the Tory party knifed her in the back because she said she wasn't going to sign the Maastricht Treaty that was coming up. So they put John Major in. And he did sign the Maastricht Treaty, and that was the big one. Up until that point, we had been subjects of Her Majesty the Queen. After that treaty, we became citizens of the European Union. Suddenly, our borders, which had been around the United Kingdom, were around 8 or 9 or 10 countries, whatever it was by then. We had lost control of our borders, very serious. When John Major signed that treaty, he followed up on Margaret Thatcher. She'd said there will be a parliament in Brussels. He signed up to the fact that that parliament would override our own on any powers that we had given away. And in these treaties, we kept giving away powers. There should have been a referendum after the Maastricht Treaty. It tore that Conservative Party in half. They only got that through on a vote of confidence in the government. It put the MPs under terrible pressure. It was an absolute disgrace. And that was the watershed when we saw our democracy go, that Maastricht Treaty. Blair comes in, and what does he do? He signs the Amsterdam Treaty. He follows up Margaret Thatcher's lead. She gave away the principle of veto. He specifies various areas of policy where he will give away the veto. One of those was in something called local aid. Now, we as a country have always felt that rural post offices are a service. They're not a business. And we put taxpayers' money towards them as a subsidy. Oh, no, you can't, say the European Union. No, that postal service is a business that other European private companies should have the opportunity to get involved in. You must stop that subsidy. Well, we'll be decent. We'll tell you can cut it in half. So we had to reduce the subsidy to the post offices. In my county of Norfolk, 63 of them closed. Everybody blamed everybody else. Only my party blamed the European Union. We were told we were mad. But that's what happened. Then, of course, he signs the Nice Treaty not long after that, and it gives away more power on asylum and immigration. Well, of course, we signed these treaties without a referendum. There should have been one after all of those treaties. But Ireland had a referendum for the Nice Treaty because it was beginning to erode their constitution. They said no. What did the European Union say? You can't say no. You're just the people who are governed by this. You must say yes. So we're going to throw money at you, and you'll vote again, and you'll say yes, which is exactly what happened. So Ireland then said yes, which meant the whole thing went through again. We didn't get the referendum. They had 5 treaties. They lumped them all together, called it a constitution. This is now your constitution. This is how we're going to run you. But they made a mistake by calling it a constitution. Other countries in Europe, hitherto, who hadn't had referendums, the consultation of the people, had to have referendums because they'd used the word constitution. France said no. Shock and horror. They should have stopped the thing there. No, the Netherlands had a referendum. They said no in an even louder voice. In the end, the EU had to accept this was dead in the water. Or was it? It went into a sulk for 3 years and came up with the Lisbon Treaty. They rewrote the Constitution, complicated legalese. They called it a treaty, so there couldn't be a referendum. So you could not be consulted on it. And, of course, the nodding donkeys all went through without any referendums, signed the Lisbon Treaty. Gordon Brown was ashamed to go and sign it, grinning in front of that flag with the other leaders. So he went there a few days later and did it in a shady little room. Now, do you like being governed by this? This is the point. Where has all this power gone? It's gone to something called the Commission. What is the Commission? It's a collection of civil servants who make laws. They're not accountable to us, and they're very well paid, good pensions, their children can go to good schools. And they churn out legislation on all the powers they've been given. So they initiate well over half, some people say 75% of all the laws that govern us. Now, if you like this, remain in the European Union. If you want a reality check, vote to get out on the 23rd of June. Because what happens when they propose legislation? Remember, they're the only ones who can do it. That comes to a committee. That's where democracy gets involved. But the MEPs want this whole project to succeed. And remember, this is a journey. This is a journey to one country, which we are on. And so the MEPs will amend these proposals, but they don't want to throw it out, because if they keep throwing out Commission proposals, the whole thing will fall flat in its face. They don't want that. They're well paid. They need the Parliament to keep going. Then it goes to something called the Council of Ministers. This is where the vetoes come in. This is where Mrs. Thatcher used to be able to say no, and the whole thing stopped. No, what happens now? We need to get a lot of people with us. This thing that Cameron's done, it's no real difference to what's happening now. If you want to get something through the Council of Ministers, you need 16 countries and 55 who must represent 55% of the population of Europe. And if you can't get that, you won't get what you want. So on 72 occasions, our ministers have been outvoted. They've had to come back from there and sell to the British public something that they did not want to govern you. I think it's very worrying indeed. But while all this has been going on, the whole thing is getting deeper and deeper, it's been getting bigger. It's gone from 6 countries to 28 countries. That means the so-called voice that we've got is very negligible. 73 MPs out of 751, one person in 28 with no veto on most subjects in the council. I mean, where are we? Do we want to be governed like this? And where is it going? And where is it going as far as we're concerned? Remember, we haven't joined the euro. We haven't done that. Only 3 countries got that privilege. All countries now in the European Union have to join the euro at some stage. Now, the number of Eurozone countries is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They now easily have the 16, because they've got 19, and they easily represent 55%. So whenever we go there now, we can be outvoted by the Eurozone, and they're hurrying on to create this one country. So when we decided not to join the euro, in spirit, at that stage, we said we really don't want to be part of this project, because to create one country, you have to have one currency, one army, one set of laws, etc., etc., etc. This is the project you are on. And yet your politicians over the last 20 years have been deceiving you. That means a minute to go, does it? Right, let's just quickly look at trade. 79 billion trade deficit we have with the European Union. We buy far more from them than we sell to them. I'm just going to look at a couple of commodities, 2 countries. France produces a lot of wine. It sells 650 million pounds worth of wine to Britain. Britain produces lamb and sells 150 million pounds worth of lamb to France. Now, who is going to rock the boat on that? It is very much in their interest to keep selling us wine. And right across the board, they will be in a hurry to have this trading arrangement. We are their biggest single customer. Forget about Norway, forget about Switzerland, forget about the 3 other models. We are unique in the relationship we can have with them, the trade we can forge. No problem at all. Just a quick word on labour. Is there time? No, there isn't time. So we'll discuss that at questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George and Stuart. To refine our process, clear that the visual cues aren't working quite as well as we perhaps thought. So if we ask that we'll have 2 bells, we'll have 1 bell at a minute to go and then 1 bell at the end. So 5 minutes from now for the next speakers. So John, over to you.
Okay, thank you. It is essential for the United Kingdom to remain in the European Union for the sake of the country, the continent, and beyond. I'd like to address a few arguments which distill why the EU has benefited Britain's economy, why our farming interests are directly related to our ongoing membership, and why we owe it to Europe to remain in the EU as a leading nation committed to peace, prosperity, and unity. The single market has been one of the greatest economic innovations in British history. Combined with Margaret Thatcher's monetarist reforms, defeating the overmighty unions and privatisations, our membership of the single market has made Britain's economy one of the most open, flexible and dynamic in the world. I support the EU as a liberal capitalist. It has helped weed out bad businesses in Britain by expanding competition and consumer choice. It has provided the impetus for innovation and has engineered greater prosperity than ever before. The contrast with the 1970s could not be starker. Britain was strike-ridden and protectionist. Unions gripped the jobs market, and the public had poor quality goods from failing industries. Thatcherite reforms would have struggled without the open markets provided by the EU, and we must stay with it. Leaving the single market, the UK would be isolated by tariffs and in limbo negotiating trade deals. Yet leaving the EU and remaining in the single market, with no say how it runs, begs the question, why bother leaving in the first place? We do a lot of business. My family business does a lot of business with a Norwegian family business. They describe their government as the photocopier for EU laws, required to follow them for access to the single market, but they have no influence on their creation. As a farmer and food processor operating right across Europe, exit would be a leap into the unknown for me and for farming generally. The Leave campaign has promised a bonfire of EU regulations. But does anyone really believe that if we leave, we will have lower environmental, employment and health and safety standards? The UK is a world leader in health and safety, and we consistently operate above the EU standards, or the minimum. The failure to dredge the rivers in Somerset, and therefore the resulting floods, that was blamed on the EU regulations. But that wasn't an EU issue at all. It was a Westminster issue. It's driven by environmental regulations in the UK. It's not an EU issue. And I can assure you that the Dutch dredge their rivers. Other regulations. Are we really going to embrace cattle growth hormones, GM crops and irradiation of food like the USA? 73% of our agri-food exports go to the EU. The possibility of leaving the single market is too great a risk for Britain's food and farming sectors to take. The EU's average tariff to agricultural produce is 12%, so a trade deal would need to be negotiated immediately. Yet Britain would be a junior partner to a European giant, rather than an equal member of the Union as we are now. The Leave campaign promises a free market, but that promise is incompatible with an exit. The promise to the UK electorate effectively takes away much of their negotiating powers. But I want to conclude with the moral issue. Leaving the European Union would be an insult to Europe and to the world. It would show Britain turning its back on the pursuit of peace and harmony in Europe. Let's face it, this isn't about Brexit. This is about break it. Having abandoned our Eastern European allies to the USSR in 1945, we owe a huge debt to nations like Poland to ensure such betrayal never happens again. We invaded Iraq in 2003. We bombed Libya, and therefore we have an obligation to sort out the resulting mess and the refugee crisis in the EU.
Thank you, John.
Leaving would be a dangerous precedent.
Thank you very much. I think you were Nick. Yeah, Nick. Sorry, I was going to Nick. Nick.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. It's always a great pleasure to be back in Ely, a place I took close interest in when I was the leader of the County Council, and I hope you're looking forward to your new bypass that is, I'm assured, still coming your way. Let us be clear. This referendum is not about choosing between leaving the EU or staying in the EU as it is today. The EU is continuing on an unstoppable journey towards ever closer political and financial union. The treaties already signed require it, and the unelected Commission wants it, whatever the Prime Minister and friend George may tell you. Over the last 30 years, the EU has changed considerably, but has always moved inexorably towards ever closer union, imposing more and more unwanted EU laws upon us. Since Cameron became the Prime Minister, the EU has introduced 4,700 business regulations, which add up to nearly 20 million words. Only 5% of British firms directly export to the EU, but 100% of these firms are impacted by EU regulation. If we stay in the EU, this process will continue with more momentum until we have been completely absorbed in a European superstate with no borders and only one supreme government, that of the EU Commission in Brussels, with an unelected president and a powerless rubber stamp of a parliament. We are already hearing about the EU planning to fast-track Turkey's entry into the EU as a response to the migrant crisis. And I'm afraid it's only the EU that could think of adding 75 million more people who will have the right to come here, who culturally have very little in common with us, that this in any way will help solve the migration problem. In my lifetime, the UK population has been around 40 million. It is now 65 million and growing, and much of this growth is from migration, and it cannot continue. Cheap imported labour has consequences. It creates job displacement for our young people, leading to long-term skills shortages. It creates wage suppression, which means more live on benefits and have less to spend in the local economy. And it drives up the cost of housing, making it difficult to attract skilled staff. A rising migrant population, often on minimum wage, often living in very poor conditions, puts a huge strain on local services, including schools, and it threatens community cohesion, as we are seeing in Wisbech, where now 1/3 of the population comes from the migrant community. This does not help to attract inward investment into our communities. Pressure will continue to grow on all countries in the EU to convert to the euro. We shall then lose control of our own interest rates and be ever more subservient to the EU Central Bank. Homogeneous taxation and legislation across the EU prevents individual countries serving the needs and aspirations of their own people, and Greece has suffered hugely under this. We shall be forced to pour ever more money into the EU, much more than the 55 million a day membership fee we hand over now. And this money could be used for our own people and for the infrastructure that our businesses require. So this referendum provides us with an opportunity to retake control of our country, an opportunity to prepare ourselves for a modern, rapidly changing world where we can command a place at the top table, an opportunity to be free from the restrictions of the EU. There are 155 countries who trade freely with EU, but are not governed by it. We can do exactly the same. I can assure you that Mr. Mercedes and Mr. BMW will insist upon trading with us when we leave the EU. I am proud of our heritage, proud of our culture, proud of our business success, and yes, I'm proud of our country.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. William.
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, everybody. An awful lot of what we hear in the current debate from both sides seems to have a tendency to describe how terrible things are going to be, either if we stay in the EU or if we leave the EU. I would actually prefer to remind ourselves about some of the positive benefits of remaining in the EU, which is something I passionately support. John has mentioned agriculture. I won't add much to that at this stage. I would just like to emphasize the benefits to all of us, farmers, food producers, and consumers, of being inside the club that sets the rules rather than outside the club that sets the rules. We've all agreed we're going to carry on trading with each other. Trade is going to inevitably involve rules. Let's be in a position where we can be involved in setting those rules. But much more important to me than any narrow focus around our industry is the wider question of peace and stability for us and for others. We all agree that the world is an increasingly unstable and threatening place. Governments and citizens around the world are struggling to maintain a sense of perspective in the face of unprecedented challenges. I think we all agree that globalization, whatever that means, is not a process which is going to be reversed. I think we all agree, therefore, that we have to work together with others to tackle these problems and these issues. The question is how best we can do that. As members of the EU, we have a seat around the table with an established bloc of democratic countries sharing many of our values. We have the opportunity as members of the EU to shape the words and actions of this extraordinarily influential group of nations from the inside, and to benefit from being part of a globally significant bloc of people. We are part, to echo what John said, of a group that has ensured that the peoples of Eastern Europe over the last 40, 50 years have turned their faces to the West rather than turning their faces to the East. I am proud to be a part of that, and I would like to carry on being a part of that process. I think we also shouldn't ignore some of the threats there are to us as a United Kingdom from this current debate. I am a passionate believer in the whole of the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I think that we have seen some of the debate going on around what would happen in Scotland if we did or didn't vote to come out, and if the Scots did or didn't vote to stay in. I think we're much better, all of us, staying together as a United Kingdom and together as part of the EU as that United Kingdom. Let's not put any of that at risk. We hear an awful lot about sovereignty and independence. As far as I can see, the UK has always been, is today, and will remain in the future, a sovereign nation. Our Parliament is free at any time to decide anything about this country. The very fact we're having this referendum demonstrates that. When we voted, if we vote to come out of the EU, our Parliament can take us out of the EU. We remain sovereign. What we have done over the years is decide through various treaties and agreements to suspend temporarily bits of our sovereignty in exchange for agreements with other people. We can end those agreements at any time, but on balance, we think there are benefits from what is on offer against what is temporarily suspended. I'm happy to carry on making those kind of agreements. Many of the things people object to are not actually about Brussels at all. They're about Westminster and how we implement our own rules, how we implement Brussels rules. Let us not fall into the trap of allowing politicians who have spent the last 40 years blaming Brussels for things they found too difficult to sort out for themselves. We end up believing them when it wasn't true then and it's not true now. So for me, this isn't about choosing between two equally threatening, miserable alternatives. It's about embracing the wonderful opportunity which membership of the EU represents.
Thank you, William. And finally, John.
Thank you and good evening. Now, I think the motion should really be, are you in or out or still undecided, as we saw earlier. In my short time, I'm going to attempt to bring back a sense of proportion to this and get things back to ground and do three things. I'm going to explain why I decided to vote to leave. I'm going to expose the myth we have just heard that the single market and the EU have been a good thing for us economically. And finally, I'm going to outline why, after a vote to leave, we should not be afraid, but we should have the opportunity for a new and prosperous future. I will share evidence with you, not rhetoric and opinions of others. For evidence, in my experience, is how successful businesses make good decisions. The referendum has shown that in public, business, politics, and indeed every walk of life, opinion is divided. Many have long held firm views and they should be respected. But there are also many business-minded people who still want to hear more, to know more, and will then decide. And until recently, I was one of you. So how did I arrive at my decision? 3 years ago, David Cameron made a speech promising a referendum and saying he would get fundamental reform of the EU backed by treaty change. I agreed and applauded that, and as a result, I voted for him in the election. Business for Britain was founded by like-minded business people who researched and produced the most comprehensive work on the EU, the changes that were needed, and what the future would look like if we were outside an unreformed EU. Not for the faint-hearted, but you'll be pleased to know that here tonight there is a summary and also a short booklet which sets out some facts. I commend it as a very thought-provoking read. The title, Change or Go, sums up its conclusions, and I leave it to you to judge whether what came back from the renegotiation represented any material change. I don't think it did, and that is why I think we should go. Next, the myth of the single market. Here's my evidence. The EU is in decline. In 1973, it represented 40% of global GDP. In 2012, Angela Merkel said that the EU accounts for 25% of global GDP and 50% of social spending. Unsustainable. The euro, the fundamental economic plank on which the EU has been formed, has been a disaster. Full fiscal and political union may still save it, but the cost has been declining GDP, soaring unemployment, and imbalance and inequality between Eurozone countries. 70% of our economy is domestic, and of the 30% that isn't, that's export, more than half, and rising all the time, is with the rest of the world outside the EU. So our future, trade-wise, lies outside of the EU and facing the rest of the world. My last and the most compelling evidence is an analysis by Civitas of published statistics. Here it is. You would think it would show that the single market had been successful. Let me read its two conclusions. The first one. The UK's exports have grown and benefited least during the single market, while those of non-member OECD countries have grown and benefited most. And secondly, there is no evidence that the single market programme has helped the exports of the UK or other founder member countries to other OECD countries. Now, to my third and final point, it is June the 24th. Project Fear has not worked and we have voted to leave the EU. What have we got to be afraid of? Nothing. Companies and customers will still talk to each other around the world. Scientists will still collaborate. Security agencies will still work together for our mutual safety. We need the EU and they need us. They need us more than we need them, so we will sit down and work out a sensible trade deal with, which is what companies want.
John, thank you very
much. My
much.
time is up. We should take back control and vote
John,
leave.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
much. John. Thank you. You know, it's actually really not easy to stand in the cathedral and address an audience such as this, not least have strong personal views. And I think some of our panel are more used to doing that than others, but I think you all did a tremendous job. So once again, a round of applause to all of you for your opening statements. Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in the first 40 minutes of this evening, and perhaps I've got some indication as to where the differences lie in this debate. But this is going to be an interesting part of the evening, where now I'm going to give each panel, each side of the debate, the chance to have 3 challenges to the other side. And so I had originally constructed this to be one person giving a challenge from each side, but if you wish to organize yourselves differently, that's fine, but the rule is you're allowed 3 challenges from one side across to the other. We have different times this time. We want this to be a little bit more rapid fire. So the questioners get a minute maximum to set their challenge and question, and then the responders get 90 seconds. So I think what we'll do on this occasion is do 15 seconds before, one bell, and then the end. And this time you're absolutely going to get cut off because we haven't got time to hang around. So we started with George speaking first, so I'm going to invite this panel to go first. We're probably best to stand at a seat. So you can stand at your seats, perhaps. It'll just be easier than going backwards and forwards.
The microphone's working, is it? Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. William, I'd like to ask you about rule setting. If you want to grow soybeans in the European Union, rule number one is they must not be a GM variety. Yet the EU imports at least 20 million tons of GM soybeans from Brazil. So the Brazilian farmers disobey the rules that the European farmers have to keep, and we all eat, or our animals all eat, GM soybeans. So what about the rules there? Another example. In this country, sheep farmers have to have something called EID, Electronic Individual Identification of their sheep. New Zealand farmers don't and export the product to the EU.
William.
Thank you for that. I think it's quite simple. We currently are members of a club. We don't necessarily agree with all the rules of that club. All right. That's somebody else's bell. Okay. If we go outside the club, we have the opportunity, should we wish, for example, to grow soya, GM soya, as the Brazilians do. We would then exclude ourselves from selling that to some of the markets where we currently operate, and we would have debates internally with our consumers about whether or not it's a good thing. What we currently have is an organized system that allows us to debate that within a known framework. Whatever our own personal views on GM and otherwise. And it's the same with the electronic identification of sheep. We have chosen to abide by these rules because they are the rules of the club to which we belong. If we don't like the rules of the club, we can either flounce out of the club or we can work within the club to change the rules. And for the wider benefits I've already discussed, I think it's better to stay within the club and work to change those rules, to improve those rules where necessary, than to find ourselves isolated and alone.
Excellent. Thank you. Whoever would like to go next?
John, as a fellow businessman, I think all of us actually here have run businesses in our time. I wanted to ask about the business case on which you base your decision to recommend to the board of UK plc that we should leave the single market. As a responsible businessman, you wouldn't make a recommendation to your board without having done a cost-benefit analysis. Open Europe, the Eurosceptic think tank, have themselves signalled that there would be a cost to Brexit. It's impossible to nail it down because we don't know how the European market would respond and on what terms. They say the best estimate would be on a par and equivalent economic impact with the banking crash. We'd get over it, but there would be an economic cost. Could I ask, firstly, have you done a cost-benefit analysis before you confidently recommend to the board that this is a good decision? And secondly, is any cost too high for you? Or is your loathing of the current situation and of your yearning for sovereignty just means any cost is worth paying?
Well, thank you for that. I too have looked at what Open Europe has said, and they've also estimated that the cost of regulation to British businesses can be as high as £33 billion. That's over and above the cost of our membership. 90% of British businesses do not actually trade with the EU, and yet 100% of them are actually subject to EU regulations. So I'm afraid there are a lot of British businesses, and I don't know which ones you've been speaking to, but ones we've been speaking to here in the east of England. Business for Britain has found that a significant majority of SMEs in the east of England feel that the EU is a burden and not a benefit. There are 5 million companies, small private companies, employing 16 million people in this country. They are the backbone of the economy. They are not the FTSE 100. You should ask them what they think of the EU, because a great deal of them are not in favour, and 70% of them we surveyed want us to do our trade deals and not leave it to Brussels to get round to it. Thank you very much.
Okay. And our next challenge from this panel.
Thank you, Chairman. I think John mentioned, and I think George did as well, about peace and harmony within Europe, and indicated by inference that the EU had somehow contributed to that peace and harmony. Let me just tell you now that those that lived through the Balkans War, and my wife's family didn't find that a particularly a useful way for the EU to spend its time. And in fact, the Third Balkan War was only stopped when NATO stepped in. Those that live in Cyprus and saw the EU attempt to stop the conflict there will not thank the EU. And I don't think also those that live in the Ukraine will be thanking too many people for the EU's heavy and clumsy-footed approach. So what is it about free movement of people within the EU that makes you think we'll be more secure rather than less?
Well, three parts to the answer. Firstly, anyone with a long memory will remember the terrible wars that blighted the first half of this century, and remember that the European Economic Community was set up principally to build peace through trade, and trade and mutual interest that comes from trade is the best protection and guarantor. Ask the people who live in Alsace and in France whether they feel safer now trading with Germany, and the answer will be yes. Secondly, with Putin knocking on the door of Eastern Europe, turning off the gas taps and threatening Lithuania and Estonia with similar treatment as in Ukraine, I put it to you that a strong Europe, economically strong, diplomatically strong, is a vital underpinning for our security. And thirdly, in the end, Europe in a very tense world has got to stand together. NATO is only as strong as our economy. Our ability to defend ourselves is only as strong as our ability to build those trade links. So far from thinking that trade is irrelevant to security, I put it to you that it is the underpinning of the prosperity and the mutuality that actually makes us safe at night.
Sure. Stuart, you mentioned the wine, which got everybody interested for sure, but you did say forget about Norway. Nigel Farage says we want to be like Norway, have a deal like Norway. There's so much discord in the Brexit camp about Norway, Switzerland. What are we going to be like? I don't know. How are you going to actually negotiate this free market that you have promised us? And how are you going to get a better deal that Norway's got, because Norway is subjected to all these regulations you've just been describing?
Norway has the agreement that it wants. Switzerland has the agreement that it wants. And there are three other models. We don't want any of them because we are in this unique position. We are their biggest single customer. And they are not going to flounce out of the room when we leave the European Union saying, well, we're not going to sell you any more wine, we're not going to sell you any more cars. Of course not. We are in the position of Tesco against a farmer-grower. Effectively, that's what we've got. We've got the whip hand. So we don't need to do what Norway does. Yes, I know Norway, in order to raise these very high tariff barriers against agricultural produce, puts some money into the EU. We don't want to do that. Whenever I've heard Farage talking about Norway, he's always said what I've just said. We can do this ourselves. Look at Iceland. Iceland wanted to join the European Union, and they then decided that they weren't going to. They withdrew from their application. If Iceland, of 300,000 people, can manage outside the European Union, they negotiated their own trading arrangement with China. Not bad for little Iceland, was it? Because they didn't want the EU to pinch the fish stocks. That's why they pulled out. If they can do it, we can do it.
Can I return the compliment to George and ask him a business question? He mentioned the CBI had come up with a figure of £3,000 as being the benefit. Just for information, the CBI does receive funding from the EU and was also passionately in favour of us joining the euro. Could you tell us, please, how that £3,000 was arrived at? Because it was described by Fact Check on Channel 4, which is their equivalent of Panorama, as not being based on any robust evidence. It was an aggregation of old, favourable surveys. Could you say you've really validated the £3,000, please?
Well, we could get into trading statistics. I suspect we'd lose the audience very quickly. The CBI, I looked today before I quoted the figure, the CBI looked at what I was trying to summarise, which is the value to every household of those cheaper imports from the European market, of the exports that we achieve, of that power of the European market. And the truth is, every family, every community in this country is prosperous because of trade. Now, it is very difficult to ring-fence those numbers, but the CBI is, on most people's account, most business people would view the CBI as a very authoritative, respectable organisation that measures the cost of business and the cost of doing business. Indeed, many of the statistics wheeled out in terms of the cost of regulation are generated by the CBI, but I don't hear you questioning their validity when it comes to the cost of regulation. Whether it's 3,000, whether it's 2,000, frankly, whether it's 1,000, even 1,000 is 3 times more than the cost of every household's contribution. My point is, you can argue about the detail, my point is, we pay in to belong to this club, and we benefit from being part of it. And by making Eastern Europe more prosperous, they're going to buy our whiskey, they're going to buy our legal services, they'll buy all the things that we specialise in. It is in our interests that Europe gets richer, and then we all get richer and more secure.
The final challenge.
I'm going to take the risk of challenging Stuart, the European insider, on his description of how Europe works and how Brussels works. Because I don't think the way in which laws and regulations are established in Brussels differs very much from the way in which they are now and would in the future be set about in our own country if we were independent. We vote for members of parliament. That same happens in Europe. There are ministers who are also elected by the people in their countries. Same thing happens in Europe. And we have civil servants who are not elected but are appointed. That's the same here too. Civil servants draft the regulations. Yep, that's the same as in Brussels. And then the elected people get to vote and decide on how they operate. That's the same in Brussels too. I don't see how it's going to be so very different when we leave.
It is completely different. It's an extraordinary system where the unelected bureaucrats actually...